Well, welcome to part 3 of our study, and we're going to be going over 3 stories during this lesson. And the 3 stories kind of show a transition once Abraham gets to the promised land of what's happening in his life. And so we'll call this lesson Faith and Failure because it shows both of them in his life. And we're going to be in chapter 12 starting off in verse 4. And so what I want you to do first is read chapter 12, verse 4, all the way down to verse 9. And then after you read verse 9, we'll come back and talk about it. All right, so you've had a chance to pause the video and read. And just a couple of quick comments about this. So we know that Abram believed God, he trusted him, and he went as the Lord had told him. That is a big step of faith. And Lot went with him. So it says, Abram went as the Lord told him. Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. And Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their possessions they had gathered, and the people that they had acquired in Haran. And they set out to go to the land of Canaan. So a lot of times back when we were kids and we took Bible school lessons on Abraham, they had the old flannel graph where you could put the picture of Abram, and he almost seemed like a homeless guy, like just he and his wife and maybe Lot a little bit, and they were out there by themselves just kind of wandering around in the desert. But when you read this, and especially in later chapters, you hear about how many servants Abram had, even those trained in warfare, how many flocks he had. We're not dealing with some just local guy who decided to go out and homestead in Canaan. We're talking about a guy who had great, immense wealth, possibly some type of noble or semi-royal administration around. He had a steward, it seems from a later chapter. Just a great man, as his name means, exalted father. He doesn't seem to be a lightweight figure in the region. And so they take their immense wealth and they go to Canaan. Now, an interesting thing is when they get there, what do? Well, the Lord appears to him, to your offspring, I will give this land, he says. And so there he built an altar to the Lord in verse 7. We look at that and say, what exactly was happening when Abram built this altar? Now, today we build churches. We do missionary work. We try to convert people. In the ancient world, the way they viewed religion is they believed that gods were tied to certain places of land. So there might be like a god of this hill, or a god of this forest, or a god who really liked this city. And so you had a geographical location tied to a god's identity. Well, for Abram to go into someone else's land, and he saw that the Canaanites were in the land at the end of verse 6, they're in the land. He goes to someone else's land and builds an altar to his God there. That's a lot like church planting. We go and we plant churches in native lands where perhaps another religion holds sway, where another dominant system exists. And we do that in faith, saying the whole earth belongs to the Lord Jesus Christ, and we're staking a claim for him. This church is a symbol that he is the Lord of this area and the Lord of this people. Well, that's really what Abram does when he goes and he puts an altar smack dab in the middle of Canaan. He is stating, this is God's place, not yours, and I follow him. And so he makes an altar. It's kind of interesting also, in the ancient Near East, we have another story from this time, the book of Job. So in the book of Job, Job is not Jewish. Job is a Middle Easterner living over here in this area of the world who worships God, and he would fulfill the role of the father priest for his family. Job also was very wealthy, and it said that when his children would have a dinner afterwards, he would go have a sacrifice for them just in case they sinned. Abram is the one building the altars. He doesn't have like an attached priest or religious guy in his organization. He takes full responsibility. He's the royal royal priest of his own clan here. And so it's interesting that the altar building that's going to take place throughout Genesis, when we read it and we kind of say, what was he saying back then? We see the faith of Abraham being a very provocative and outspoken advocate for this God who commanded him to leave one place and go to another. He's really putting his full faith in God at this point. And so we see his success, his faith, but then there comes another part. And in this way, Abram is so much like us because we often have a great success followed by a great failure. We do a great act of faith followed by a pretty big blunder. And so right now in chapter 12, read verse 10 all the way to the end of the chapter, and then we'll come back and discuss that. All right, so you've read about Abram and Sarai in Egypt. Now there's a famine in the land, and Abram goes to Egypt. This was common. Egypt was the breadbasket of the Mediterranean, even during the Roman Empire. There were times that the Romans were upset because they got a lot of their grain from Egypt to feed Rome. They could not feed their capital city with just the grain in Rome or in Italy, and so they would have to import it from Egypt. Egypt could produce a lot more grain because of the Nile River and the flat farmland than a lot of other places in that part of the world, and it had been the breadbasket for a long time. And you can see that during this time, Abram goes down there because he was pretty close first and foremost, but also it had the reputation of just being a land of plenty where there was steady water and you could grow whatever you wanted. And so he goes down there, and of course he starts fearing. He starts getting afraid that, they're going to see my beautiful wife and they're going to steal her and kill me. This is interesting because, first off, it assumes that when Abraham would go to Egypt, which is a pretty powerful place, he would be recognized. Now, if he was just a refugee with a couple of dozen people, no one would recognize him. But he must have had a big enough entourage and big enough flocks that he would have been a person of renown and maybe the target for some enterprising official to try to hoodwink or steal and ransom family members or whatever. So he just wants to say, listen, I'm going to say it's my sister, and that way I'll make an alliance with the people around me. So he's trying to buy his safety. Well, it doesn't work because in verse 17, the Lord afflicts Pharaoh. And Pharaoh calls Abram, says, what is this you've done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she's my sister so that I took her for my wife? Now then, here's your wife. Take her and go. Now he's done with him. And they sent him away with his wife, all that he had. So God scared Pharaoh big time. And Abram gets out of this. God preserves him. But he doesn't get out of it having been a successfully faithful and obedient servant of this God that sent him. He gets out of it just because God basically covers the slack. So we see that right after Abram's first statement of faith, he builds an altar right in front of those Canaanites. Now he's kind of hiding and he fails. So chapter 13 is going to kind of pick up where this left off. I'm going to let you read chapter 13, and then we'll come back and end the story together. Well, you've had a chance to read chapter 13. And the way chapter 13 goes, I kind of imagine it that Abram says he went up from Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him, into the Negeb. Now the Negeb is in the southern part of Israel. It's down by the desert, and if you look at the picture I post last lesson, you would see that it's at the border at the bottom. And it reminds us in verse 2 that now Abram was very rich in livestock and silver and in gold. You know, rich person, great father, exalted father, big guy, not wandering homeless Bedouin. He journeyed on from the Negeb as far as Bethel to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place where he had made an altar at first. You almost imagine that Abram is like, where is God? I don't know where I've left him. Maybe we just go back to the beginning where I built this altar and he talked to me and we see what's happened. But nothing happens at first. And so you have this struggle then where the herdsmen of Lot and the herdsmen of Abram, because they're so rich, they can't even dwell together. Now the famine, I'm sure, was taxing the land and making things not produce as prolifically as they would, but they couldn't even stay together. And there's this strife. And it says at that time the Canaanites and the Perizzites were dwelling in the land. So I guess they couldn't go down into the land where the cities were. They had to stay out in this high ridge line that runs around where they're at and kind of just eke out a living with their massive flocks of livestock. So in the middle of this conflict, Abram said to Lot, verse 8, "Let there be no strife between you and me, and between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, for we are kinsmen. Is not the whole land before you? Separate yourself from me. If you take the left hand, then I will go to the right, or if you take the right hand, then I will go left." And Lot lifted up his eyes, and he saw the Jordan Valley was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt in the direction of Zoar. And so Lot looks out and he sees this beautiful Jordan River Valley down from the hills that he's on, and he says, "I'll take that. We'll move there." So he moves down by the cities Sodom and Gomorrah, and they're gone. And in verse 14, the Lord said to Abram after Lot had separated from him, "Lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward, southward, eastward, and westward. For all the land that you see I will give to you, and to your offspring forever. I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth, so that if one can count the dust of the earth, your offspring also can be counted. Arise, walk through the length and the breadth of the land, for I will give it to you." So Abram moved his tent and came and settled by the oaks of Mamre, which are at Hebron. And there he built an altar to the Lord. So we see that Abram, after letting Lot pick with his eyes, Abram is met by God and commended. The promise is restated to him that he will have land there. And it's almost like, remember we said he went back to that altar saying, "Where did I go wrong? Where is God? How can I get out of this?" And God shows up because Abram has been faithful once more and trusted him to provide. And at the end, it ends with altar building, just like the first story. He's making a statement. This is God's land. I trust his promises, and I'm his servant. So just a couple of quick recaps here. At the first story, we saw that Abraham was acting in faith because he built an altar in the land of Canaan after he obeyed God to move there. He's saying that God's rule is tied to this land. But then when the famine happens, he trusts his own resources to help him survive. He begins to doubt that this land is really that good or that God could keep him safe, and he goes to Egypt and tries to fix it by lying. Well, God protects Abram with a warning, and oftentimes we end up getting into situations where we try to fix things ourselves, and God stays faithful to us. He may let us get into some trouble, but his promises are always going to be kept. And so he keeps the promise to Abram. He protects Sarai, and he protects him and gets him out of Egypt. With the new challenge with Lot and his herdsmen, Abram responds to the challenge by trusting God to help him survive. He could have picked the nice Jordan River Valley and said, "I'm going to move down here. It's like Egypt." But he would have been out of the land God told him to move to. And so Lot, of course, chooses with his eyes what he thinks is good, but Lot ends up in a place of sin because he's trusting his own resources. And so Lot moves away from the blessing of his uncle and his statements of faith and the altars that he made. So Lot, we really see that this is the beginning of Lot's downfall. Now, there are going to be two more stories involving Lot coming up, and we're going to see that this really was Lot's high point. When he chose by the eyes of what he thought was good, not by the eyes of faith, Lot descended off the high ridge he was on at Hebron down into the valley, but also into a very sinful culture and environment. And so Lot moves away from blessing. Lot moves away from his uncle. But Abram makes a statement of faith by building another altar to God after he meets him and restates the promises to him. It's always interesting that our obedience to God is always met with not a sense of God rewarding us or saying you've earned this, but with something greater than even our obedience could deserve. So all Abram did was said, I trust God to feed my flocks. And God shows up and says, look at this land. Look at it. It's yours. You know how many kids or descendants you're going to have? Can you count the sand? Then you can't count them. Abram didn't earn that by just trusting God to feed his sheep. Abram didn't earn that by building a rock altar. Those blessings that God gives, even though they're in response to obedience, are not wages for obedience. They're more blessings and grace of God. Even in our own lives, we see that we don't earn blessing by obeying. We are blessed if we obey, but we don't earn those blessings. What God gives in response to our obedience is always just many times over anything we could have possibly earned by our little small actions of obedience that really we look at it and say, well, it's just reasonable to trust God. But God goes over and above in pouring out blessings through that. Also, just a note about failure. We're going to see a lot of failures in Abram's life. He is a messy, bruised, stumbling believer like the rest of us. And oftentimes when we stumble, we think, well, I've messed up God's plan. I've messed up his purpose for my life. I guess I just ought to stay in Egypt and deal with it. But that's not the way the Christian life works. God's promises are always bigger than our failures. God's promises define us. Our failures don't define us. When we get involved in things that God tells us we shouldn't be involved in, or if we act in a certain way that God says that's not the way a believer should act, the first step we should do, like Abraham, is go back to where we last heard God. He went back to an altar. We go back to Scripture. Go back to where you last left off, pick up the pieces and just watch. Oftentimes God will send something into your life and you know the next step. Well, I blew it last time, Lord, when I went to Egypt. So this time I'm going to trust that you'll provide for me. You said this is the land. We're going to stay here. And so when God oftentimes meets us after we've just messed it up, but we do what's right, we end up realizing that God has restored everything. He's fixed it. There may be consequences, but he's oftentimes done so much more to alleviate those. We end up in a better place than we were at the beginning. And that doesn't condone the failure, and that doesn't make it a light thing. That just shows how wonderful the mercies of God are in the life of a faithful believer. So I hope as we've seen Abraham's faith, his failure, and then his faith again, we'll have kind of a paradigm for the Christian life where we say, you know, I messed up yesterday. That was a tough little test, and I didn't really act the way I should have, but I know God's faithful, and I know his promise is sure, and I know that next time he meets me, I know what to do, to obey and to trust him. So I hope you enjoyed part 3. We'll pick up part 4 after this. See you later. Bye.